Good afternoon from New York. I'm just waiting for it to download for everyone. We have an incredible program for you today. Major Andrew Fox, that you all know, will be joining us to discuss ELNET's 32nd delegation to Israel of military leaders from 6 NATO countries. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But just a few highlights about where we are as we near the 1-year mark of this terrible multi-front war that Israel is confronting. It's becoming clearer that the hostage deal is not in the offings, unfortunately, largely because Sinwar is refusing to negotiate. And this raises many questions about what comes next on the eve of the high Jewish holidays in Israel, the US elections, etc. The North is heating up, as you're following very closely. And the question is what Israel will decide to do vis-a-vis the North. The South, of course, Iran and its allies are moving, proxies are moving assets into Jordan or through Jordan onto the West Bank, where another front is becoming very intense. You all know that the Houthis in Yemen fired a rocket towards the center of Israel yesterday. That is also a strategic development. The Houthis are also, there are intelligence that the Houthis are planning ground incursions into Israel from Syria or Iraq. So we're looking again at a very, very tense and complicated situation. I'll just add 2 points that hopefully we'll discuss today as well, is that not only do we know that the United States is withholding certain arms from Israel, but we're seeing this taking place in Europe as well. The ICC and the decision is impending, and that, of course, will have a major impact on Europe and Israel. This is where ELNET needs to spring into action, and we're planning to do this, to work in parliaments and governments to make sure that this doesn't affect the relationship with Israel. And of course, the fact that Iran is transferring ballistic missiles now to Russia to attack Ukraine is a very important international development. And this brings us to the question of, will Europe step up and engage in the process of snapback sanctions against Iran? And this is all coming up in the coming weeks. So there's much to pay attention to and much where ELNET can play a critical role. So we call on our supporters to help us complete our campaign for this year so that we have the funding and the resources to continue doing this vital work and to bring the delegations to Israel. So without further ado, Mark Sachs is our excellent director in the Southeast United States. Mark, floor is yours to introduce the topic and our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Welcome, Andrew. As you know, Andrew, but I'll inform everybody else, our eloquent UK CEO, Joan Ryan, was supposed to lead today's conversation, but she fell under the weather. And I jumped at this opportunity. I have followed you on Twitter, Andrew, for most of this year. And I've developed what I think is a sense of kinship here, almost like a fellow traveler in this upside down world where truth and logic are met with fallacies and feelings. So thanks for joining us today as we parse through facts from fiction. During the first week of September, ELNET and the military experts panel brought its first ever joint delegation of top defense officials, military strategists, journalists, legal experts, and decorated combat veterans from 6 NATO countries to Israel. ELNET obtained unprecedented access for your delegation to the most sensitive areas within Gaza and to the military and political leadership responsible for Israel's military strategy. The delegation entered Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing, traversed the 14K or just under 9-mile Philadelphia corridor, and met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. Andrew was a co-leader of that delegation, and we are really privileged to have him here today. So again, welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and by way of background, Andrew had a commendable and distinguished career in the British Army, where his service from 2005 to 2021 included 3 tours in Afghanistan, notably with the U.S. Army Special Forces. He served in the Parachute Regiment and the Special Forces Support Group, with additional tours in Bosnia, the Middle East, and Northern Ireland. And after his active service, Andrew transitioned to academia, serving as a senior lecturer in the War Studies and Behavioral Science departments at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and currently serves as a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. His academic credentials are equally impressive. He holds degrees in law and politics, modern war studies, and psychology, and his areas of expertise include defense, the Middle East, and disinformation. So, Andrew, we have a lot to discuss, so let's jump right to it. You and Richard Kemp led this delegation comprised of some really impressive military veterans. Chris Ryan, who's a retired sergeant in the British SAS, Jeff Teagues, lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Delta Forces, General Sir John McCall, former deputy commander, Allied Forces in Europe, not to mention 15 others who are equally as impressive. What was the thinking behind this delegation? In other words, I'm sure you had certain objectives that you want to achieve. So what were those objectives, and did you meet them?
Yeah, I think we really did. And the key point is that what we were bringing to Israel is people who understand what they see. And that's so much of the trouble when it comes to the narrative on Israel at the moment, is that people look at what's happening in Gaza, but they don't have the kind of facility or the experience or the knowledge to actually process what they're seeing. And it's only when you have military experts who understand what warfare looks like, you understand the frictions and the complications and difficulties of what it means to fight a war, only then do that you sort of get that analysis that you need to properly go out to the world and share that analysis in depth and educate other people on what they're seeing in Gaza. And the best example, I think, is the destruction that we see there. Now, I think anyone who's been to a war zone knows that it comes with destruction. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but until you've actually seen it firsthand, it's very difficult to understand the scale and the extent of damage, particularly in an urban war, as we see in Gaza. And so what people are generally doing is seeing that destruction, and they are attaching an emotional reaction to it, which is entirely understandable because it looks horrific. But we sort of need to have experts who can say, okay, that emotional reaction, we had that too. Absolutely. Seeing that level of damage is horrible, but we understand that there are tunnels. We understand that there is an enemy that's fighting in every building, in every mosque, every school, every hospital. And we understand that the level of damage comes because of those enemies that are fighting in that area, and not because it's just a wanton trail of destruction by the IDF acting on malign motives. And by bringing people to these delegations, it gives us the opportunity to have more and more experts who can explain this in clear terms in the way people will understand.
There's a lot there that I'd like to unpackage, because you almost answered, or at least alluded to, several of my questions in advance of me asking them. So I'm going to go one at a time here.
Sure.
I'd imagine that most of these men on the delegation, given their previous military background, have worked with Israeli intelligence or Israeli special forces at some point within their career. So they had, I would think, a predisposition towards Israel. In fact, on Twitter, and I've seen you respond to some of these, you're going to see comments to that effect. This is just more Israeli propaganda, which calls, of course, into question your credibility and the credibility of those on this trip. How do you respond to that?
You know, I've been on a number of trips to Israel now, and so my position is firmly established. But I think everything that I've put out, I've tried to back up with evidence that I've seen with my own eyes, and I think that's really important. Now, it's very easy to say, yes, of course, the Israelis have paid for you to go on a trip, and that's fine. But, you know, I was with General Sir John McCall. He's got a knighthood. He reached 4-star general. He was given the second highest rank that is possible to achieve in the British Army in terms of being Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He was the number 2 in NATO. And he, on the flight out, was genuinely skeptical. And he's been quite open about that when he's written about it and spoken about it since he returned from the trip. And I can testify that he was. We were on the plane and he was, you know, tutting and shaking his head at what he thought was a complete lack of rules of engagement, what he thought was an excessively violent response. But as I said, you know, in my first answer, once you take him there and, you know, the IDF can walk him through rules of engagement, they can walk him through their operational design, they can walk him through the terrain in Gaza itself and explain what's going on. And he did a complete 180, and I saw that over the course of just 4 short days. So I think that's the most important thing here, is that when you have someone of that rank and that stature, you know, he's not going to be necessarily bribable by Israeli shekels. He's not going to be prepared to throw away 36 years of hard-earned reputation to kind of publicize a genocide. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I think that the credibility that comes from someone of that stature being initially skeptical and coming around to kind of understanding what's actually happening, I think that's a very, very powerful thing. And that's what we were trying to achieve with this visit.
Yeah, he wrote a powerful op-ed that I'm sure you saw in the Times, and it's gone viral, speaking exactly to what you just you said. You know, you and many on this delegation know as well as anyone, and probably better than most, what urban combat is like. You saw the evil committed by ISIS and others. You've seen the horrors of war, one of which are the deaths of non-combatants. And you know, pressure is being applied to the US, UK, Germany, and other countries by those claiming Israel is violating the very standard operating procedures or laws of the rules of conduct in war that you mentioned just a moment ago. They're violating human rights, and they're using words like genocide or disproportionality. What, if anything, on this trip, and I'm assuming there are plenty, that impacted these men by what they learned, what they saw, and were there any lessons that, or what are some of the lessons that you walked away from that you could share?
The most impressive one for me personally was speaking to Major General Goldfuss, who is the commander of, I think it's 96th Division. He is a gentleman whose division has cleared through most of Khan Yunis and a number of the sort of areas in the north of Gaza. And personally, I think what he said was absolutely revelatory from a military perspective. The IDF have mastered simultaneous, coordinated, above and below ground combined arms maneuver. And to break down what that means is they're able to put troops in the tunnels, they're able to maneuver troops coordinated with those ones underground, above ground. So it's a simultaneous clearance of the area they're operating in. They're able to incorporate airstrikes, they're able to incorporate drones and other intelligence gathering materials. And they can move almost faster underground now than they could above ground at the start of the war. That's a genuinely impressive tactical development. And I don't think there's any other army in the world that can do that at the moment. And that's incredible. Why is it important? Well, the really key point here is that, you know, Israel aren't going to do this if they're going for nefarious ends. You don't need to clear tunnels if you just want to kill everybody. If your aim is to wipe Gaza off the map, then you just take down the buildings. Because, you know, yes, they can live in the tunnels, but they can't sustain a long and happy life underground. So if you're applying the Genocide Convention and rendering it unlivable and trying to kill everyone, you just level the buildings. You don't risk your own troops, your own dogs, your own people underground when you're trying to do that. So I think when you look at the operational design and you look at everything Israel is doing tactically on the ground, it rapidly becomes very clear that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. That is trying to dismantle Hamas.
So you raise a good point. I've often questioned the argument that Israel doesn't have a good PR. I think it's somewhat blaming the victim for something that is clearly obvious across the globe. Iran doesn't have a very good PR program. North Korea doesn't have a very good PR program, nor does China for that matter. But we seem to think it's Israel's fault for not telling all the great news or the good things that Israel's trying to do. Having said that, do you think that Israel could be doing something more about getting this information out there? Or is it more just a lack of will to believe what Israel is telling the world and believing people like you?
I think I'm going to reframe that slightly, if I may, if I could reframe the problem slightly. I think, first of all, you know, Iran and China and everyone don't have particularly good PR systems, but the Palestinians do. They have an exceptional PR program that's been portraying them as helpless victims for 60 plus years now. You know, they the word Palestinian was even created in the 60s to be used in this Arab context. It was never really the group of displaced Arabs from 1948 were never really referred to as Palestinians. Actually, before that, it was more commonly used to refer to Jewish people in the region of Palestine. So they've had a phenomenal 60 years on the PR campaign side of things. But that PR campaign is really heavily predicated on emotion. And the issue is when someone has taken a position based on emotion, it is almost impossible to reason them out of it because there's no reason to argue with. You can't argue with feelings. And I think where Israel could have done better, and I think they have been doing better actually in the last week since we got back. And I don't know if that's because Sir John McCall actually genuinely chest poked Benjamin Netanyahu about this at some length, and maybe that's had the difference. Maybe ELNET have actually made the difference to the PR campaign on a global scale. But they have been much better over the last week, and it's because they're showing stuff that connects to people. It's all very well showing Admiral Hagari stood in front of an Israeli flag telling people what's happened, but I don't think that gives any emotional connection whatsoever. And instead, by showing the tunnels where Hirsch, Goldberg, and the other hostages all were murdered, and showing the spot where they fell and the dreadful conditions they lived in and the appalling way they were treated, by showing that to the world, it's an incredibly powerful emotional message. And it's that's going to win people round to Israel's way of thinking. I mean, you could make the case that it's perhaps too little too late, and I guess we're still to see how that plays out. But that's my take on it. I think Israel needs to be more emotionally engaging, whilst retaining that all-important factual honesty, rather than the emotion generating lies from the Hamas side.
Interesting. You mentioned the hostages with Hirsch just a moment ago, so let's go there. You might have seen the J-Post article that was recently published about the ELNET delegation that you led, and it was titled "Former Delta Force Officer: Israel may have to choose between saving hostages and destroying Hamas," and you were quoted in there as well. Has a country in modern history ever faced the calculation that Israel is facing right now? And could you discuss the decision tree that Israel has to go through to weigh this calculation, and what actions perhaps you think Israel would have to make in such a case?
Yeah, and it's really tricky. It's really tricky because if you look at the three articulated war aims: secure Israel's borders, dismantle Hamas, free the hostages. And the killer question here that I think is plaguing Israeli strategy is, how do you free the hostages and dismantle Hamas? Because the hostages are the one thing that's stopping Hamas from being dismantled. So how do we resolve that paradox is the key issue. And I suspect there are going to have to be concessions, and what will be weighing on the Israeli government's mind is the fact that they are balancing the future security of 10 million Israelis versus the very present safety of 101 Israelis. And that's a horrible piece of calculus and mathematics that they're going to have to make a decision on. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing the kind of political splits within Israel between Mr. Gallant and Mr. Netanyahu. They both, within a space of 3 or 4 hours, they briefed us diametrically opposite strategies for Gaza. It's the hostages that are causing all of that friction and tension when it comes to the future strategy. Because if you want them back, you're going to have to give concessions. And giving concessions means that you probably won't dismantle Hamas completely. So that's where we are. And, I guess that's why politicians are there to make those decisions. But I certainly don't envy them the choice that I think is looming in their direction right now.
Yeah, it's unimaginable how to make such a calculation for the protection of 8 million and the protection of 100. Important, both, and certainly emotionally heart-wrenching to have to make that calculation. Just to remind everybody, we will open it up to questions. So if you have questions, send in your questions. Andrew, let's see, I think you once noted on Twitter, and by all means, edit what I say appropriately, but if I remember correctly, you don't, or you didn't really have a dog in this fight. You're not Jewish, not Israeli. You never considered yourself Zionist or pro-Israel per se. So why are you doing this? I mean, leaders often have the arrows or the bullets in their chest because they're the ones leading the way. You really are. I would characterize in some way somewhat of you're a leader and a hero on the Twitterverse because you're willing to do battle within this cesspool of ideas and sentiments. But why are you doing this?
Well, I think I spent the bulk of my adult life fighting against Islamic extremism of the nature that we see represented by Hamas. So that's a factor. My grandfather was 8th US Army, and he certainly saw Dachau in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I think that left a very profound effect on him as a family member. I had a very, very dear Jewish friend who was killed in Afghanistan, serving with the Rifles Regiment. And so when I see anti-Semitism explode on the internet, I kind of feel that maybe I have a duty to say things that he no longer can and stand up for him. But I think more broadly, this conflict has just brought a number of my expertise areas into alignment. So I'm an ex-soldier with a war studies master's in the Middle East, and I have a psychology master's in the psychology of disinformation. And so when a Middle Eastern war that is saturated with disinformation broke out, I felt I had things to say. But I think is a kind of overarching thing here. It all comes back to the 7th of October. And I'm, I suppose, unlucky enough that I've seen more footage and evidence from that day than 99.9% of people have. And even with 3 tours, all of them combat tours in Afghanistan under my belt, I can honestly say I've never seen anything that comes close to the sheer unadulterated horror of what happened on 7th of October. And actually, I think the world at large don't really understand how bad it was. I think they know that lots of Israelis were killed, but I don't think they realised the extent of not only the barbarity of how people were treated, but also the sheer glee and joy with which the perpetrators carried those acts out. It's hard to articulate how someone loses their humanity in that way. But ultimately, I think Israel is fighting demons, and they're doing it in a way that is far more restrained than I think almost any other army would be after 7th of October. And I think my sense of right and wrong is just very activated when I see Israel get hammered for things like genocide, when actually they're the victims of an attempted genocide. They're the victims of an enemy that wantonly and carelessly, deliberately killed as many civilians as they could, and yet they're accused of that as well. So it's really my right, all of those underlying factors that build up the kind of foundations. But that's my overarching thing, is that it's just a sense of right and wrong. And I think Israel is right, and disinformation merchants are wrong. And I'm very happy to stand up and say that.
I don't want to mischaracterize sort of what I would say your for lack of a better word, progression through this. But I'll say it, and again, let you recharacterize it in the way or respond the way you want. Initially, it seems there was an academic orientation. Again, you've brought up your studies and your experience, so there's an academic orientation to the way you would initially approach this. But it's evolved into something much more. And this may be a distinction without a difference, but I'm interested to know, what was it that moved you from the academic orientation to something much more, what I would say, meaningful? Was it October 7th and the atrocities committed, or was it the way people responded to October 7th that really cast you in a certain direction?
Yeah, I think it was the latter, for the simple reason that when I first started engaging in this discussion, I wasn't aware of the full extent of 7th of October. Now, I was in Telegram groups and I'd seen some bits, and I was like, I was appalled, clearly, but I hadn't realised the sheer depths of it at that point. But what I really did object to, I think, was on October the 7th, people in London celebrating it. That was a really powerful, seismic change in my perspective on how Jewish people in the West get treated. I've got a lot of friends in the UK who are Jewish. I worked very closely with them when I was helping evacuate Afghans from Afghanistan when the fall of Kabul happened, and I saw the profound effects that those celebrations had on them. And that really opened my eyes to certain issues in the West that I wasn't particularly aware of, if I'm honest, in terms of anti-Semitism and the way certain other community groups can potentially treat Jewish people. So that's kind of the emotional generation. And then I went to Israel, and then I learned a lot more about 7th October. And whilst my military strategic analysis, I don't think has changed very much, my sense of outrage at the way the narrative around this war has developed has certainly grown as time has gone on.
Thank you for that. One last question, and then I will open it up to, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Flesch to offer a few words, and then we'll open it up to questions. You met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. You met with Defense Minister Gallant. Was there consensus from the group on what recommendations you would make to them, or what recommendations perhaps were made to them in how they should deal with this multi-front war? And I would include in that multi-front war the media as well. But what recommendations did you suggest to them on how they should confront what's facing Israel?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think we focused on things like better communications and rules of engagement, better engagement on an emotional level. I think that's where our advice was really focused, because John McCall was not only convinced by his trip, he was also almost mildly annoyed that he'd been lied to by the world's media. You know, I got a sense of real irritation coming off him that the Israeli information campaign had been so blown out of the water that he had to actually go to Israel and experience this firsthand. And I think he felt that he'd been misled heavily by the world's media. So a lot of our advice was directed on some of that side of things and how Israel sells this war better, because you do need to do that. You know, you do need a degree of international consent. You do need to keep the United States on side. You know, that political lobbying effort is so vitally important. I thought when it came to Mr. Gallant's position, he said he wanted to ceasefire Gaza, give up the territory held, and then go and focus on the north because there are 60,000 Israelis displaced. So for him, Hezbollah was the priority. Mr. Netanyahu had the opposite position, where he wants to retain the Philadelphia corridor and complete the mission in Gaza before moving onto the north. So there's a very, very clear split there. And again, there's that calculus, though, that what does dealing with the north actually look like in real terms? And does Israel have the capability to do it? Because if you start pushing your ground forces, you know, over the border to clear Hezbollah back north of the tiny river, that's going to cause huge amounts of destruction. Again, Israel's going to be getting hammered on the international stage. It's entirely possible that Beirut ends up looking like Gaza does now. And, you know, is there another way to secure the northern border? And is a ceasefire in Gaza going to be enough to get people to stop firing from Lebanon? I mean, potentially, but even then, is that still safe? Would you move back to your home in Israel knowing that Hezbollah are just over the border? I'm not sure I would. So, you know, the solutions to that northern issue are really challenging, and there's no sort of easy answer. And as ever with the Middle East, it's about picking probably what is the least worst option rather than the best option, which is never an ideal place to be.
If there's anything everyone on this call should walk away with, is nothing is binary. It's not as simple as this answer or that answer. It's incredibly complex, and really appreciate you weighing in on these very complex issues. So Tom Flesch, I'd like to welcome to the floor.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mark, for really conducting this really insightful dialogue. And to you, Andrew Fox, I mentioned to you before, you came through with some great insights and wonderful information that is very inspirational. And speaking about inspiration, I want to say that I do believe, as a result of many of the things that ELNET is doing, and specifically this last delegation that sent the retired military people into Gaza with that tour, and the reports that have come as a result, I sincerely believe it influenced the article in the New York Times just the day before yesterday, or perhaps it was yesterday, front page, about how barbaric Hamas is fighting the war, what they're doing with disregard for human life, and that the Israelis are conducting a war that's basically unprecedented with the care that they're taking for humanity. And so when I read that in the New York Times, I was surprised that that tone was in the article. And I feel it was a result of that mission. And I thank you for what you did and what you said about it. And speaking about ELNET, our work just seems to be getting more and more important as time goes on. And we're getting into areas that are extremely important, especially in Europe. And with the change in leadership, we have a lot to do. And this work can only be done with the support from the people that have been supporters and will be supporters of what we do. We have a pretty good sized audience. Not all of you donate. I'm asking you, it doesn't matter if it's a small donation or a large donation. We not need participation, and we need donations from everybody to continue our work. So whatever you can contribute will be greatly appreciated and is very much needed. And with that, I just want to say thank you for your support. Tell your friends and tell yourself even to make your donations. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tom, very much. All right, everybody, we're going to go to questions. Joseph Hyman, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
All right, I didn't expect to be called on. Mine is a tactical question. We hear a lot of speculation about what's the real rationale behind Israel not giving up the Philadelphia corridor, right? And there are two opposing views, one or both may be true. So asking you kind of an unfair question, based on your experience and your analysis of being down there, what credence do you lend to the argument that the reason that they can't give up the corridor is because Sinwar might escape and take hostages with him, versus the notion that it would open the gateway to a dramatic increase in weapons being smuggled into Gaza? How much credence do you lend to each idea, and to the best of your ability? And is it possible that both are true?
Yeah, so we're seeing some interesting, I think it's internal, probably briefing conflicts from the Israeli side on this one. So the IDF seem to have gone on a little bit of information warfare maneuvers of their own this week by briefing that they only found 9 tunnels into Egypt, and all of them were already sealed by the Egyptians. I think this is really interesting because there's a number of elements at play here. Now, they briefed me when I was there that there were 14 tunnels found. So there's been an incorrect level of briefing here at some point. So that's the first kind of red flag, as it were. The second red flag is, whilst of course the tunnels may have been blocked, that doesn't mean they can't be opened again should Hamas take back over. And Hamas haven't needed necessarily the tunnels to Egypt recently because the Egyptians have been facilitating the passage of contraband just straight through the Rafah crossing. So, there's no guarantee that the tunnels are going to be used or not should Israel withdraw, but there's certainly a risk. So what do we have to do to prevent that? I mean, option one is, of course, maintain troops on the Philadelphia corridor indefinitely, which is, I think a difficult one because it will make them easy targets should Hamas try and re-infiltrate and all that kind of thing. They have built a buffer zone for the Philadelphia corridor. They've built a road now; it's tarmacked. So there's indications that they've made it as safe for themselves as possible, up to the point where they can take people in. The next question is, how do we stop the smuggling if Israel doesn't have troops on the border? And you've got a variety of options here. You can have electronic detection of digging buried into the ground. You could even build an underground wall. You could pay off the Egyptians to make sure that they do a better job this time than they have done in the past. But October the 7th taught us the dangers of relying on technology in such things. There was a deterrence policy based around technology, cameras, remote machine guns, and a very complicated defensive wall, and that didn't work demonstrably on 7th of October. So over-reliance on a technological solution, I would be exceptionally wary of, given the past 11 months example of how that can go wrong. So I think to sort of summarize what I'm saying here is that something needs to be done in the south of Gaza to prevent Hamas rearming and re-infiltrating. And of course, potentially just to prevent people fleeing south into Egypt and then to elsewhere. What that something looks like is either ground troops or technology or the Egyptians doing it. And none of those options are ideal. The one I do lean to is the Netanyahu position personally. I think it's not the right time for a hostage deal yet. There's still too much of Hamas intact, too many tunnels intact. And I think more pressure needs to be put on Hamas before they will agree to a deal that's in any way acceptable to Israel. So for me, it looks like retaining the Philadelphia corridor for a little bit longer at least.
John Mirish, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. My question is, why isn't there more outrage internationally at Hamas's unprecedented use of civilians as human shields? The lack of outrage would seem to encourage further use of civilians as pawns. And what can we do to counter this?
I think it's a lack of outrage from a lack of knowledge. I think people just don't understand what's happening. There has been a narrative since long before 7th of October, that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. And this goes back to sort of 2014, if not before that. You heard that word being thrown around. But what that did was kind of pave the way. In psychology, it's called cognitive fluency. If someone throws you an idea that you've kind of already got, then you'll take that idea on board really, really easily. So when Israel launched a very, very violent air campaign in North Gaza City, and you already have a vague idea that perhaps it's a genocide, and someone starts screaming genocide, then you're just going to accept that. And it's very tricky then to argue someone out of that position, because it's not based on fact. It's based on a lack of understanding. And I think every time the argument has been put forward to those people that Israel is taking exceptional civilian care, that actually a lot of the buildings you see destroyed were empty before they were struck. When you tell people that Hamas are putting people in harm's way and hiding in humanitarian zones, that message just doesn't strike home, because they've got cognitive dissonance from what they think they already know to be true. So telling them an alternative truth just doesn't hit home. So it's really tricky. And my working theory on this, it's not my definitive answer, but it's my working theory, is that you've got three groups in a war for the narrative like this. You've got the people who you will never persuade. You've got the people who agree with you, and then you've got the people who are on the fence. And they're such a tiny percentage that all you can do is really make sure that you shore up your own side, that you persuade as many neutrals as you can. And the most you can do with the people that disagree with you is try and inject some doubt, some tiny scintilla of doubt. And I think that's as good as it gets at this point. But that's my working theory. I'll have to get back to you with a concrete one. But that's I think why this hasn't come across, is because people just already were so preconditioned to believe that Israel were conducting appalling acts, that actually, when you tell them the truth, they don't even really consider it as an option.
But look at your colleague that did a 180. I mean, I get it. You can't send everyone to Israel, but maybe people like him who were on the fence before are better spokespeople in a way than yourself. Maybe you can get people like that, some of the people who ELNET sends to Israel, to be those spokespeople to convince people on the fence.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the model that we're trying to enact. You know, we're taking people who can explain this because they have credibility, and we're showing them the truth, and then they can go back to the world. And as you say, we've had articles in the Times of London and a variety of other international publications as a direct result of showing people the truth. And I think that's very, very powerful.
Thank you, John. Larry, let's go to Larry Hochberg.
This is a trifle off of your expertise, but when we had Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister of the UK, he understood the situation. He was supportive, even with the drones from Iran, and our life was much easier. Now we have Keir Starmer and David Lammy, and they are from a different mindset. What can we do? What does it take to convince them that they are breaking up the alliance by picking at Israel with let's say, not supplying a few small military things that really don't make much difference? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was really tricky. It was an embarrassing time to be British in Israel 2 weeks ago, as all this stuff came out. There is an inherent tension in the Labour Party that they are very reliant on the Muslim immigrant vote in certain constituencies in the UK. And so there is a need to keep them broadly on side from the Labour Party's perspective. For example, during the last general election, 5 seats went to pro-Gaza independent MPs, which is deeply worrying. There's a very, very strong subversion. I spoke earlier about cognitive fluency and people being persuaded to ideas that they already hold. No more so is that true than parts of the British Muslim community, and that's been very, very challenging, I think, for both Jewish people in the UK and people who are trying to push the Israeli cause, on the national debate. Labour have undertaken a variety of heavily anti-Israeli policy moves since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. They withdrew their opposition to the ICC arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. They have started refunding UNRWA in spite of the sea of evidence to suggest how closely linked they are to Hamas. And of course, now they've stopped the bare minimum of arms sales to Israel. And I think these are all incredibly performative measures. There's absolutely nothing of substance that comes from what the British government has done in terms of affecting the course of the war in Israel. By the same token, David Lammy's tour of Israel has done nothing but burn bridges. He's just demanding everyone just cease fire. You're all as bad as each other. Knock your heads together. Just stop fighting. And it's a puerile and deeply amateur way of doing international politics, unfortunately. But it's all performative. It's all designed to try and shore up the Labour core vote. It was so heavily influenced by the disinformation campaign coming out of Gaza. So it's very much a British domestic issue. I think they've done the minimum they can get away with and still not sever all diplomatic ties with Israel. But I understand that it's upset the USA, and rightly so. It's upset me as well. I deeply disapprove of everything they've done, full stop in power, actually, but particularly towards Israel. So I think in terms of what we can do about it, I suspect at this point, very, very little.
That's a sad but honest answer.
So, Andrew, if we extend this out a little bit, it's beyond just Israel. Obviously, the malevolent force in the entire Middle East is Iran.
Yeah.
What do the actions that the UK is taking, and even the US perhaps, what message does that send to Iran, and what would you advocate Europe do to contend with Iran?
Yeah, I think the message we've been sending to Iran throughout this conflict is that they can get away with what they're doing if they use their proxies and their information warfare campaign to do what they've done. It's astonishing that the Houthis, directly backed proxy, directly armed and funded by Iran, have been allowed to have such a catastrophic impact on global shipping for nearly a year now. And nobody has done anything about the problem at source. Yes, Israel's had a great raid on Holiday Port. Yes, the Royal Navy has been intercepting drones. Yes, the US Navy has been doing the same. But nobody's actually dealing with the problem at core here. It's like having, it's like having a medical illness and just treating the symptoms and not the cause. And I don't think this is particularly sustainable, particularly should Iran make the moves that we've seen suggested that they might move towards nuclear weapons. The regime in Tehran cannot be allowed to be a nuclear power. They cannot be allowed to extend that nuclear umbrella over the Middle East. And they need to be held accountable. And it's been frustrating to me this week that accountability is coming not because they're trying to destroy the state of Israel, but because they've sold ballistic missiles to Russia. I think that's a real failure of international diplomacy, that people haven't understood what is actually going on in the Middle East, and or if they have understood it, they're not taking the correct action to deal with the problem.
I want to ask you something that's relevant to what you just mentioned, as well as bring in sort of the idea of disinformation. There's a truism in warfare that it's not enough that the winner win, but that the loser recognize they lost. With disinformation, the availability of information, is that construct possible today?
No, it depends when we're talking about who the enemy is, really. I mean, is it Sinwar and his coterie in Gaza? Is it the Palestinian people? Is it the international audience that's watching this war? I mean, who do we need to convince that the war is won? I don't know if winning a war is even the most helpful framing of this. I think it's achieving strategic goals or not achieving strategic goals. I think it's a better way to frame it. This isn't, a battle like the Middle Ages where two armies would duke it out on a field. The winner would run away victorious with a clear and obvious, decisive defeat of their enemy. And if we go back to that first principles and look at the strategic goals, particularly in Gaza, the wider strategic goals, I'm not entirely sure are that clear right now. But in Gaza, it's secure Israel's border, return the hostages, and dismantle Hamas. There will come a point where Sinwar knows he either has to negotiate or die. It's that simple, and it's that point that he's trying to push off as far as he can right now with an international campaign to put pressure on Israel to back off. And of course, by using the hostages as well to dissuade Israel from striking certain areas within Gaza. And the challenge for the IDF is to get Sinwar to that point where he understands that the war is over and he has to either surrender or die. Or flee the country. I mean, I think in 1982, PLO option is distasteful, but if it gets Sinwar out of Gaza, if it gets him away from where he's got the most influence, then that's no bad thing. But when it comes to the wider war, this is Iran. It comes back to the last question. It's like, how do you persuade Iran that they're beaten? Well, if you've just beaten their proxies, you haven't beaten Iran. And I'm in favour of slightly more direct military action towards Iran right now. I think they have crossed the red line more times than I can count, and their proxies need dealing with, and the regime in Tehran need dealing with. And there's a number of levers you can pull on that. One of which is military, another of which is diplomatic, another of which is economic. But those levers need to be pulled sooner rather than later before we end up with a malign nuclear state in the Middle East.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and this has been a sobering conversation, but I'm going to challenge you with leaving us with something more optimistic. What gives you hope? What leaves you optimistic? It could be almost anything, but leave us today with something to look forward to, with some optimism that all is not lost, and that Israel, Europe, United States, and those in the West have something to look forward to.
I'm British, right?
I'm in South Florida where it's sunny, so come on.
Your American optimism. I'll try and get myself in that headspace. I think the first thing that I think should encourage any Americans is, whilst the political rhetoric has been suboptimal at the White House level, actually what we're seeing from the US armed forces is an unfailing allyship to Israel. I think that's really, really important to note, is that US forces are very heavily involved with the IDF. They're doing a lot of liaison, and a lot of the missions and actions that have been facilitated, particularly outside of Israel's borders, have been fully with American cooperation. I think that's a really good sign for the future, that actually, whilst there's a bit of political friction, Israel and the United States do remain very, very tight allies. And I think that's definitely something I would be optimistic about. And I think the next thing I would be optimistic about is the sheer resilience of people in Israel. I've been so remarkably impressed by how well people bear up under what must be an enduring and terrible strain for the last 11 months of a society that's that tight and that well connected. Everyone's only 2 or 3 stages away from knowing someone who was killed on 7th of October who is a hostage. And yet you go to Israel and there's still this incredible, vibrant positivity amongst the ordinary Israelis you meet in the street. And then I think that's after 11 months of war, that's a remarkable testimony to the strength of Israeli society. So those are the 2 things I would take away to give you an optimistic finale to the, like you say, a very challenging and difficult discussion.
2 excellent examples. So thanks for that. Thanks for your time, everybody. As a reminder, and just to bring this home, these delegations matter. The reality is they're not inexpensive. They are incredibly costly. They are difficult to pull off, but the returns on them are just priceless. So for those of you who support the organization, who look to people like Andrew Fox as leaders in framing the discussion around Israel and the importance of people like Andrew, please support our work. Follow Andrew on Twitter. He's great. Mr. Andrew Fox, I think. Is that what it is on? Right?
That's it.
So follow him on Twitter. And thank you again. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you again, Andrew, very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.